Just a real quick introduction. I'm a go-to-market lead for security here at Rubrik. My role is to help evangelize a little bit of what where Rubrik kind of sits in the data security space. Data protection has evolved beyond just backup and recovery and has really centered more around data security. So I'm going to teach you a little bit of the basics, the 101 on data protection, so that you have some idea of the world that we come from, and then show you how Rubrik is evolving in the data security space. And hopefully this clicker works reliably for me, because it doesn't seem like I have the magic touch. And it's not working. Here we go. So our agenda, we're going to talk about data security. As I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about recoverability. This is the 101 section on data protection. We'll talk a little bit about best practices around data protection. It is important to note that cyber insurers are really focused a lot on customers' protection environment and their protection posture. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about how we're addressing some of the blind spots when it comes to data security, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts. And again, I hope to let you guys go early here since we are at the end of the day. So the question really is your data safe and available for recovery? A lot of the folks here and a lot of the sponsors here are really focused on the perimeter, focused on keeping the bad guys out. And that really should be primary objective number one. Let's keep the threat adversaries out of our networks. But we know that the bad guys are getting through those perimeter layers, right? Those firewall and IPS, IDS devices, they're evading notice from DLP type tools, and they're getting to the data, and they're performing denial of data attacks, things like ransomware, data exfiltration, data deletion. These are things that the cyber attackers and the threat adversaries are doing to data. The thing is you need visibility into what they're doing when they're doing it. And that's really where it helps to kind of look at the data layer out when it comes to your security posture. And cyber threats are really becoming the main driver for recovery and resilience, right? And a lot of data protection vendors are stuck talking about immutability and air gapping. And for us, that's table stakes. So I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But know that Rubrik's got you covered from a resilience perspective. The question is, how can we provide forensic information for the backup data? And that's really where we're going to drive that conversation. All right. I'm sorry, that built out. And this clicker does not work as well. Sometimes I do it with this one, it works better. All right. So we know that coupling infrastructure security with data security is really tantamount here. This is what's going to give you end-to-end security. In the data security realm, we're really centered around three pillars of security. The first is resiliency, the ability to get your data back. Again, we'll talk a little bit about that. Observability, this is forensic information that you can glean from the backup data, and then remediation, which is the ultimate recovery effort on the other side. And we'll talk about recovery at the end here. There we go. I'll get this thing soon enough. In terms of our evolution in the company, it's really started in 2014 is when the company was founded. In 2015 was our first go-to-market. It was really centered all around a better mousetrap for backup. It was taking the complexity of a typical data protection environment, catalog servers, media servers, usually storage that's hanging off the network, and collapsing that down into a hyper-converged platform that was immutable by its nature and air-gapped by its nature. As you can see, our air-gapping is a different approach. We're not physically disconnected from the network. The backup appliance is always on the network. It's just the backup data itself is not accessible on the network via open protocols. So that's really a key differentiator for us. We don't ever disconnect the appliance from the network. It always remains online, therefore logically air-gapped. And again, that's been in the product since version 1. In 2018, when I joined the company, a lot of the talk was around the shift to cloud and the movement to cloud, the ability to be able to protect everything from a single pane of glass, provide protection both for infrastructure on-prem as well as infrastructure in the cloud, platform as a service and software as a service, as well as the integrations that we built with ITSM systems and SIM and SOAR systems. And then in 2020 or so, the world sort of changed, and this pivot to data security became critical to the company. It's really centered all around 3 observability features. The first is understanding the blast radius of an attack, which systems have been impacted, and which items within those systems have been impacted. Sensitive data monitoring and management, the ability to understand very broadly where my sensitive data is located and who has access. And then threat monitoring and hunting, the ability to go and hunt for malware, whether that's detonated malware or pre-detonated malware that might live on my systems by scanning the backups directly. This is really where Rubrik has sort of centered its observability tools around this, and this is where our company is focused right now, as on growing out our portfolio of data security products. Some stats here for you. This first stat is a Rubrik stat. About 38% of our customers' applications go unprotected on average, which may be surprising to you. These next 2 stats are from a Sophos, the Ponemon report, the cost of a data breach report. 73 days on average are needed for breaches to be contained. And about 52% of the costs are costs within 12 months. So those are near-line costs. That means that little less than half of the costs are long breach costs, reputational damage, class action lawsuits, et cetera, et cetera. And then this last stat here, about 700 hours are needed for operations to be restored. So in other words, time equals money. The point is, can we shorten the amount of time it takes to get back to business? The more that we can shorten that, the more that companies are going to benefit from that. So let's talk about recoverability. This is some of the data protection 101 material that I have for you guys here. So you gotta, you're taking backups at a frequency, right? Those could be snapshots. Those backups are happening at a regular interval. A cyber attack occurs, and then business is resumed as usual. That time in between there is your RTO, your recovery time objective, and we'll talk about the difference between RPO and RTO here in a bit. But know that there are snapshots that are the last snapshot that's taken prior to the cyber attack occurring is your last known good. That's really going to be the one that you're going to rely on, and the one that's really critical to be able to understand and find. So 2 different concepts to be familiar with here. The first is recovery point objective. This is the point you can recover from. This knob is easy to turn. All you have to do is change the frequency and how you protect things, and that's going to change your recovery point objective. The second knob is not so easy to turn. This is recovery time objective. This is the physics of recovery, the time it takes to get the data from point A to point B, from the backup platform to the source system. And there's a lot of things in play there. So that's not a very easy knob to turn, but it's one that's critical when you're architecting your data protection environment to take into account. That proximity is very important. Nearness to the data is very important whenever you're embarking on any sort of recovery mission. RPOs, how much data loss can you tolerate, really, is what it comes down to. It's the ability to define a backup frequency based on a schedule. That frequency is usually in terms of constant intervals. Could be backup every 4 hours, or it could be based on calendar elements like backup on the last day of each month, backup prior to a very large software install that I happen to do, et cetera, et cetera. And the rule of thumb, really, and this is sort of our assumption, and you'll see in future slides that our assumptions got smashed a little bit as we went and analyzed our customers' data, is the rule of thumb is that the loss is minimized by the frequency, which is usually impacted by the criticality of the data. Right? So we're assuming that customers are looking at the criticality of the data, determining what their data loss thresholds could be, and then making decisions on frequency based on that. And I think you'll see in future slides that's not the case. So we were really surprised by that. In terms of frequency of change, databases represent the fastest changing objects within the Rubrik ecosystem. This is based on 3,278 Rubrik customers and the telemetry data that they pass up to us. We're able to determine, based on the type of data, how they're protecting it, how often they're protecting it, and how long they're keeping it around for. And what we've noticed is that highest changing objects are typically databases. You would expect that to be the case. So none of this data is surprising. Fast changing objects, you would hope, would be the most important to back up frequently. And what we're seeing from a frequency perspective is that databases are at the bottom of the chain. And at the end of the day, customers aren't really looking at frequency or importance or criticality of the data. They're basically backing everything up once a day and retaining it for an amount of time. And we'll talk about retention here in a little bit. So in our mind, the backup frequency really needs to be based on risk. How much data loss can you tolerate, right? And that's really critical, and it's something that goes overlooked. And what that goes back to is doing proper asset classification. Understanding the importance of the assets within your environment, how much data loss you can tolerate as a result of frequency. So this was a really surprising stat for us. When we looked across our customer base, we would have hoped that there would have been more variation on frequency based on well-planned data asset management, because well-planned data asset management should really result in divergence in these frequencies, and it's not. So that tells us that customers are just basically applying a blanket policy to all of their environments. And you'll see why, because we make it really easy in our product to do that. Oops, whoa, that is not what I wanted there. Okay, I got it. I think that's where I wanted to be. Go back one more. Man, this thing. Sorry, guys. All right, forward. One, please. RTOs. How quickly can you recover? And one of the important backup rules and the data protection rules in general is this concept of 3-2-1. And this may be foreign to you, it may not be. So I'm gonna articulate here in a bit. Means 3 copies of your data, 1 primary. Proximity, again, is very important when it comes to the primary copy of your data. And ensuring that that primary copy is resilient, meaning it's immutable and it's air-gapped. So primary copy and 2 secondary copies, that's 3 copies of your data. 2 different types of storage media. So that could be block storage and object storage. That's very typical what people are doing nowadays. Block storage and tape. Still typical, still being used today. And at least 1 copy of that data stored off-site, meaning it does not live in my network at all. Doesn't live in my primary data center, it doesn't live in my secondary data center, it is stored off-site. Could be a cloud provider, could be object storage in a cloud provider. But the bottom line is that RTO is very centered around physics. And its proximity is really important. So the primary copy of your data should be assured resilient. And if it's not, then your RTOs are going to be longer, which is going to take you a longer time to get back to business. Hence, the costs are going to pile up. There we go. So here's what we found from an RTO perspective, and in terms of retention, the amount of data that people keep around. People are keeping NAS data around the longest. This is really surprising to us, right? Think about it. NAS data and environment file data is important to a lot of companies, but not all. And it's typically very large. And people are keeping NAS data around locally, meaning on that first copy, for a year or close to a year. So what does that tell us? That tells us that file data is becoming more important to enterprises, right? That's the number one takeaway from that. And that efficiency of recovery of file data is really important as well to enterprises, hence the importance. But are they really looking at importance? And we're gonna talk a little bit about that as well. All right, some best practices. So this is the blessing and the curse of Rubrik, right? This is our SLA Domain Policy. This is all you need to do to ensure protection of an asset in your environment. You give us broad parameters on how often you want us to protect something. You tell us how long you want to keep it around for. There are other screens after this that deal with things like replicating to another site or archiving that data once it's hit the end of its life. But this is it for the most part. This is really the only screen you have to fill out. Once this is filled out, we're basically ensuring recovery for those workloads. This same SLA policy can apply to all workloads in your environment. Databases, VMs, file sets, it doesn't matter. We'll apply this policy across the board. Hence why I call it the blessing and the curse. It is easy to do this, and you don't have to maintain any backup jobs or schedules, which are really the bane of a backup admin's existence. But we're making it really easy to just apply one policy to everything. And we're not looking at criticality of the data, and our customers are not doing proper asset classification, hence the RPOs are not really being taken into account when it comes to risk. And that's really what's important here. So know your assets. The lesson learned here is know your assets to implement protection policies that are tailored to your business needs. Tie those assets to applications, tie those applications to business functions, tie those business functions to revenue. And this may seem very 101, but you'd be surprised how many organizations don't do this well. And that's the reason why we see organizations blanket posting everything across the board at once a day and not really looking at RPOs or RTOs when it comes to importance of the data. Put a dollar sign on that asset. That's going to help you achieve an optimal RPO and RTO. Once the importance is placed, it should be just as easy as taking the most high value assets, starting at the top, working your way down, and making proper backup schedules according to the importance of the asset. Not all protection should be equal. So if there were one thing that you would leave with today from this, I hope it's this. And the other best practice that we've seen from our customers, because we do help handhold our customers through ransomware attacks. We have a ransomware recovery team within Rubrik that really is white glove service for recovery for our customers. And the one thing they've noticed is the customers that have gamed this out versus the customers that haven't are the ones that are back up quicker than the ones who have not gamed it out. So practice. Practice, practice, practice. Practice with the tools, but also practice with the people in the process. Tabletop exercises, war games. Mandiant can help with that. Rubrik has a mock tabletop exercise we call Save the Data that we're doing across the country. We'd be happy to do it at your organization. It's basically just giving you some empathy on what organizations go through when they're faced with a cyber attack within their environment. Involve IT in those tabletop exercises. They're going to play a key role, right? So SecOps and IT need to collaborate. Define tiers for recovery. And it should be based on criticality. It should be based on criticality of that system or service and getting that service back up and running the quickest. Determine what methods are going to be used for recovery. Are you going to do ephemeral recovery? Are you going to do physical recovery to a clean room? Right? These are all things that need to be considered. Have a plan to isolate a system that might be infected. You need to prevent malware spread throughout the network, so you want to isolate that system. Either recover it ephemerally to the Rubrik environment or recover it to a clean room. Understand how to determine when systems can be restored to production. In other words, what are the gates that need to be met in order to ensure that a system is ready to be recovered to production? Some folks will decide to just rehydrate the system with the good data and leave the bad data behind and then just nuke the system from the top. And that is a very common recovery, and that's a perfectly valid recovery mechanism. A lot of our customers use that methodology. But know for every workload how you're going to determine when that system is ready to be recovered to production. Let's talk a little bit about what are some of the blind spots that we've observed in our customer base. And the way that we feel we can help is based on really two different things. First is the larger surface area of backup, right? Backup is the only thing in your environment that has visibility to every critical asset across any number of days, across any number of points in time within those days. So we'll call it a forensic time series. Backup by itself is inherently a forensic time series. You have nothing else in your environment that has this. So use it. And that's something that Rubrik has basically bet the business on, that we can leverage and activate that data to do forensic work that would otherwise take a long time to do. And we're able to gauge the breadth and depth of an attack without relying on production systems. We're relying on backup data. We can get a full picture of sensitive data and whether there's any malware in those systems by looking at our backup data as well. Moving silos across the recovery plan, doing it in a fully hosted and integrated platform that's delivered as SaaS, so those things are delivered seamlessly to your instance. That's really all critical to how we can help accelerate any recovery effort. All right. The first would be to accurately determine the scope of an attack. This is not easy to do if you don't have something that's looking for both anomalous behavior, but I'll be clear, let's not stop at anomalies, because most anomalies are users doing anomalous things. They are not events that warrant immediacy, typically. But if you have an anomaly that's coupled with signs of malicious encryption, then you know you might have something that needs to be reacted to. And that's really where we differentiate. We don't just look at anomalies. We determine what is the typical rate of change. We'll alert if it falls out of bounds of what is the typical rate of change. And guess how we can determine what the typical rate of change is? We back up those things. We know how they change over time. So it's easy for us to determine how an asset within your environment changes. And then we'll couple that with encryption detection to go and check that snapshot looking for signs of malicious encryption. If we find both, we'll throw a critical alert. That critical alert should be pushed to a SIM SOAR and should be acted on immediately. This is really what's giving you the blast radius. Both the blast radius within the estate as well as the blast radius within the system itself. We get down to the file and folder level, and we can show you at a file and folder level what the impact of that attack was. The other benefit of doing this against the backup is that you can drive recovery from that single pane of glass. So we can show you which files have been deleted and which ones are suspicious. You can take everything that's been deleted and you can rehydrate that somewhere, all within the same investigative workflow. You don't have to leave that investigative workflow to do that. You can just recover that out of band somewhere else. So really critical, and the need for speed is really important here. So that's what we're driving towards. Next is sensitive data. The ability to discover sensitive data both proactively as well as reactively. And this is important. Reactively, you need the time series to be able to discover what the sensitive data looked like at time of attack. Time of attack could have been 3 days ago. Your sensitive data tools that might be monitoring for sensitive data are looking at the live system. They're telling you what the sensitive data landscape was at that point in time, at that day. They're not telling you what it looked like 3 days ago. So the reactive approach would be, show me what the sensitive data landscape on that system looked like at time of attack, so I can let legal and compliance know what my risk is and what my exposure is, so we can determine what the fallout would be as a result of that. But use it proactively. Use it proactively to scan for sensitive data broadly across the estate, because guess what? And you guys might get a chuckle out of this. Sensitive data is not always where you expect it to be. And one of the tools that people use to determine sensitive data are usually storing and looking for sensitive data in locations where they expect it to be and not where they don't expect it to be. So it's really important to look very broadly across the estate to understand where is my sensitive data and also who has access, right? Tie that back to your directory services so you can check who has access. If there's any sensitive data in your environment that's over-permissioned, you need to reduce the permissions on that data immediately. And again, do it broadly across the estate, because you never know where sensitive data can be found. Let's talk a little bit about threat hunting. We're going to pivot a little bit here. I talk about threat hunting. The first is the process of threat hunting in and of itself, right? There's a breach that's detected. I have to identify what the entry point was and that last clean recovery point. I'm going to engage 2 teams to do that. Security is going to tell IT what to recover and where. IT is going to go and do that. They're going to restore that environment to a SecOps lab or a clean room to be scanned. They're going to scan for malware. If they don't find that clean recovery point, guess what? They go back to the next system and the next snapshot. And we're talking could be hundreds of systems across tens of snapshots or even hundreds of snapshots. Imagine if you had to do that iteratively over every system to understand what is my last clean recovery point. Well, guess what? We have the data in our platform already. This is the immutable forensic time series. That data is sitting there. Why don't we just take threat intelligence and apply it directly to the backups themselves? And that's really what Rubrik has introduced around our threat monitoring capability, threat hunting and monitoring capability, is to take threat intelligence from threat intelligence sources like Mandiant, like CrowdStrike. Could be a list of hashes, maybe it's a Yarrow rule or a list of Yarrow rules. Take that threat intelligence and go and scan the snapshots, the backup snapshots at rest. You're scanning multiple systems across multiple recovery points without having to recover those systems anywhere. There's no physical instantiation required of those systems to do the hunt. We're not going to be a source of threat intelligence anytime soon. So the goal is that we're going to partner with our partners, and we're going to get valid threat intelligence to go and hunt for threats that either might have already detonated in the case of a reactive workflow, but it might be in proactive use cases. I have customers that are looking for the hashes for the log4j jar files that are vulnerable, and they're just scanning their entire backup estate, looking for where those files live in their environment. Or maybe they're just looking for undetonated malware. They've had malware that's been in the system in the past. They know what hashes those are. They go and scan for that malware against the rest of their systems proactively to understand, is there any undetonated malware in my system? So again, doing that against the backups is a huge differentiator and a huge time savings, is what's going to help you get back to business quicker. And the last piece is we have to integrate with security teams' single pane of glass. If we don't integrate with their single pane of glass, it's all for naught. So having integrations into SIEM and SOAR platforms, we have pre-built integrations into 2 SIEM platforms, Palo Alto's Cortex XSOAR and Microsoft Sentinel. We have workbooks with those environments. We can push actions back to the backup environment as a result of an anomaly getting pushed or sensitive data being found in a particular environment. We can push an action back that says, put that backup on legal hold because that has sensitive data in it. Or recover that system because that system is compromised and it needs to be recovered. Or run a threat hunt against that system with this particular bit of threat intelligence that I've gotten from my IR provider. Right? These are things that can be done against the backup and actions that we can push back into the Rubrik environment from these single pane of glass systems. And I think it's really a game changer for us in terms of these integrations and wanting to build and mature these. So really important. So some final thoughts before we wrap. And I know it's me. I'm in between you and happy hour. So I'm going to let you guys go early here. Happy to take any questions at the end of this as well. First is our mission. It's really to secure the data wherever it lives. Could be enterprise, could be cloud, could be SaaS. It doesn't matter. It's really all about 3 pillars. Resiliency, ensuring that the data is going to be there when you need it. Observability, giving you forensics about what's happening for your data so you make better decisions upon recovery. And then recovery. Doing that recovery en masse, doing that recovery granularly, depending on what the objectives are. A case study, this is South Louisiana Community College. This is a customer that I was involved with directly. Had 0 data loss as a result of an attack, did not pay an ounce in ransom, had 100% recovery in less than 2 hours. Now this is a small shop, So your mileage will vary, depends on how much where the tendrils have gone and how much data is actually impacted and how much you need to recover. As I mentioned, physics comes into play here, right? So it's going to take time, but this environment was hugely successful using Rubrik to recover from an attack, and yeah, we hope to be able to replicate this at lots of our customers. And that's all I had. Thanks for attending. I can take any questions from anybody, but hopefully you guys found this valuable. Thanks.